Good morning. Good morning to the people out in the gallery. Good morning. You have 90 seconds to find your seat. Good morning to the people in the gallery who want, in fact, to be in here. Finish your donut or whatever, your bran muffin, your banana. Bring it with you. Clean up around you. Whatever your mother would say to you. That woman who lives in all of our heads. I know I live in my children's heads. That could be a really bad thing. Now you have 30 seconds. Are we ready to go? You don't want to give them their 30 seconds? You don't care about the slow pokes in the back? Okay, they got 30 seconds. Now they don't. Now they only have 5 seconds. Okay, here we go. Good morning to you all, and grace and peace to you from God who loves us all so very deeply. I am really happy to welcome you again to MTSO, to those of you who are returning, who were here as students and who now come as wisdom leaders in your various communities, or as the tired folk dragging in off the street, whichever one you want to recognize yourself as. I'm really glad that you're here. And I'm particularly glad that you're here to receive from and to be in conversation with Professor, author, and scholar Wes Allen, Jr. Now, before I introduce him, I have a really important question to ask him publicly. Roll Tide or War Eagle? Roll Tide. Okay. He's on the wrong side of the Alabama divide, but... Yes, but, and I'm on the side with his wife, which means we are right. But he will tell you that when you grow up in Alabama, you have to choose pretty much right after they spank you. Like, you have to know, you don't have a choice, except for in our house, we were divided. Yeah, and I have to be real honest. I became a war eagle or a tiger or whatever Auburn is on any given day. Plainsmen, you know, they can't make up their mind what they want to be in rebellion. My dad was a Roll Tide all the way fan. So when I became a teenager, I became a war eagle, and I have remained so. May he rest in peace, my dad. Wes, though he is on the wrong side of the Alabama divide, has his specializations among the Synoptic Gospels. He did his dissertation on Luke, Acts. You've seen this. He's done a lot of writing around this, and I am particularly interested in a book that he did on preaching in the era of Trump, and the book he's working on now, which I presume he will talk a little bit about. But if you were here for preaching, you know that he's an engaging preacher. He's just as an engaging teacher. So get ready for the ride.
Well, I am really glad to have this time with you. We're going to be running through the Gospel of Mark this hour, so I want to get right started, but I want to start with a personal note. So I did grow up in Alabama. Specifically, I grew up in Sylacauga, Alabama, which is right there. Sylacauga is a Cherokee word that means buzzard roost, and never was a town better named. Nothing to do there, so the buzzards just sit around waiting for you to die. But as bad as things were in Sylacauga, this arrow shows you where Childersburg is. Now notice, Childersburg doesn't even get mentioned. It's not worth being mentioned. That's where Dr. Bridgman is from. Childersburg is a word that means we wish we were from Sylacauga. I had no good feelings toward Childersburg until years later I met Dr. Bridgman. We found out we grew up within 10 miles of each other. And I've been praying for her ever since. All right, let me begin by stating my thesis directly, and then we'll back into it. My thesis is simply that Mark is best read as a parable from beginning to end, the whole document as a parable. In this lecture, I'm going to avoid a lot of name dropping and sort of showing you the scholars behind my work, but I want to mention a couple right here at the beginning to be fair and honest. Two scholars who influenced my thinking about Mark's parable especially are Werner Kelber and John Donahue. They convinced me by reading them of the parabolic nature of Mark. But I add to them Ched Myers, who you might have read Binding the Strong Man, who reads Mark from a very political Marxist perspective. And I don't agree with his overall argument, but I've never read him on any passage that I can go, why did I never see that before? So putting those together have made a big difference. I'm also indebted to C.H. Dodd. His classic definition of parables is the one we're going to use. I've adapted it a little bit. This is a definition that goes back to the 1940s, but it's extremely helpful, I think, still today, and sort of has set the tone for all parable scholarship that follows. A parable is a narrative metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, familiar to the hearers, which arrests the hearers by its vividness or strangeness, and leaves their minds in sufficient doubt about its precise interpretation or application in order to tease it into active thought, even to the point of altering their worldview. Scholars like wordy. At least this wasn't a definition written by Bart. I would have had to go over 4 or 5 slides. So let's just break it down real quickly. A narrative metaphor or simile, in other words, the whole of the narrative is the metaphor for whatever is being compared. Dodd was especially concerned with parables of the kingdom, parables of the reign of God. And so most of those parables are comparing the reign of God to the whole narrative. Drawn from nature or common life, familiar. So what hooks you into a parable is that you already know or think you know what the person's talking about. So we're going to look at this one here. So we've got a mustard seed grows into the... Well, everybody in an ancient agrarian society knew about mustard seeds. So we're right there. It arrests the hearers by its vividness or strangeness. So there's a twist in most parables, something unexpected. So in this one from Luke, is Luke's version of the mustard seed. It grew and became a tree. Any ancient person knows there's no such thing as a mustard tree. So they have 2 options. One, they can think Jesus is just stupid, which everybody knows Jesus also would know that a shrub would be not a tree. So they assume Jesus is intentionally twisting the image for them. So what's going on in that? That leads to the next part. Leaves their minds in sufficient doubt about its precise interpretation or application in order to tease it into active thought. In other words, parables don't answer questions, they raise questions. Which makes preaching them awfully hard, by the way. And so that's what we're going to talk about in our workshop a little bit. But if we shift this definition a little bit and apply it to Mark, went the wrong way. Then we see Mark as a parabolic narrative, so from beginning to end, drawn from the familiar story of Jesus. So I assume the original hearers were already insiders to the Christian community. They already knew the story. It arrests the hearers by its strangeness. In other words, Mark is intentionally twisting the story of Jesus to have people raise questions about its interpretation of Jesus and to reconsider their own faith stance, their own discipleship, especially in relation to Christology. And I'll unpack why that is as we go through. So, I think any attempt to read Mark at the surface level, either literally, historically, or just theologically at the surface, misses a lot of what's there. I was raised being taught that Mark was the simplest of the Gospels. It's just this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And then darn Frank Kermode comes along and tells us all, no, it's a lot more going on here. And so I want to play with what that more is. The beginning point then is the end of the gospel. And what I'm going to be doing is flashing up text. I'm not going to have time to read them. So I hope you've got your Bible around or you take notes. This is going to be archived and streamed so that you can see it later and all. But I'm just going to refer to the text up here while you can read it and listen along. But here we are at the very end of the story. And you know the end. At the very last line, the women leave and tell nothing. It's a double negative in the Greek. It's really strong. For they were afraid. That's not the way this story is supposed to end. Anybody who's familiar with the story of Jesus knows there's resurrection appearances. We've read 1 Corinthians 15. We know how this goes. We've been told these stories. What is Mark doing? So the very ending of Mark, this failed ending, this open ending, leads us back to the beginning of the gospel. So before we jump there, though, I want to say why I think Mark was written as a parable in the first place in terms of the timing of it. Most scholars agree that Mark was written around the year 70 when the temple was destroyed, the end of the Jewish war, with that phase of it. And scholars argue for this because of the language, especially in chapter 13, the Eschatological Discourse. It begins with Jesus predicting the fall of the temple after somebody has said, look, what big stones? And Jesus says, oh, not going to be anything soon. It's all going to be destroyed. And then goes on, they ask when the temple the discourse unfolds in apocalyptic language. And we get down to this line where he's quoting Daniel. He says, but when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. That little phrase that we put in parentheses in English is key to understanding the whole of Mark, I think, and other scholars do too, because this is the one place where the narrator breaks the fourth wall and acknowledges a conversation with the original audience. That's not Jesus talking about readers. So the narrator interrupts Jesus' speech and says, this is what you need to recognize. So it puts the whole of the gospel into a relationship with the fall of the temple. I think what's at stake here is that the temple was the very symbol of God's presence in the ancient world, not just for Jews, but also for the early church. Dealing with the fall of the temple was a crisis moment. Imagine the Jewish revolt going on. The Roman army is approaching and surrounding Rome. Not just Jews asking, is God going to step in and save this moment? But early Christians going, this is the moment when Jesus will return. This is the Christ moment right here. But of course, the temple falls. When the temple is destroyed, people question their faith. Is Rome stronger than my God? Which is exactly why you destroy a temple. You take away any religious fervor of your people. I think Mark is trying to keep people in the faith. This is a moment of theodicy for his community. Have we followed the wrong person? Have we staked our lives in the wrong place? And I think Mark wants to say, no, you've staked your faith in the wrong place, but it's the wrong faith. And I'm going to help you reconsider your faith. So Mark, I think, is a theodicy parable. If we're going to unpack Mark from beginning to end in the 50 minutes we have left here, it might be helpful to give some broad structural sense of where we lay. So every narrative, you've seen this before, starts with a hook that grabs you in. There's rising action that's characterized by conflict. It goes up to a climax, and there's resolution at the end. Mark, as a whole, follows this. When we preach, we often preach on little bitty passages, so we don't pay attention to the whole. But we've got the prologue, 1 through 15, that opens, that gets us in. Long rising action, really sort of across two sections, the Galilean ministry and the traveling towards Jerusalem all together. The Jerusalem narrative itself, the temple conflicts, the passion narrative are the climax for Mark. And then, of course, just 16, 1 through 8 is a little resolution. But we've already seen it's not much of a resolution. So we're going to begin with the prologue, 15 very dense verses that set out Mark's parabolic direction from the beginning. The first line, first sentence, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, I believe is the title for the whole book. A lot of scholars have come to this point more and more. It is not just the opening of the prologue. It is what defines the purpose of the whole book. So that first word, beginning, the beginning, is very important. Mark never claims to write the whole of the good news. So when we get to 16:8 and the story just seems to end without being fulfilled, well, it's because Mark has said, I'm only writing the beginning. So we begin to see the parable right here, the opening, although we wouldn't know it until later. The good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. So it's a Christologically focused book, as are all the Gospels. We're going to see how these titles play out later. Jumping ahead, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth, was baptized by John in the Jordan. Mark begins with the ministry of John, and then Jesus appears for the first time in the narrative as a character in verse 9. Unlike Matthew and Luke, Mark has no birth narrative. So it's in this scene where Jesus is anointed, Messiahed, if you will, adopted, a private epiphany. The other gospel, Matthew says, this is my son. Mark says, you are my son. The voice speaks directly to Jesus. And notice how this echoes back to the title. Son of God, you are my son, the beloved. With you I'm well pleased. So notice where we stand as readers. We get to hear something those around Jesus do not. No one in the story hears the voice say this to Jesus, but the narrator lets us in. So it's the beginning of irony, where the readers know something that characters in the story don't, like the emperor's new clothes. Everybody reading it knows he's naked, but no one in the story does until the little boy goes, hey, where's his clothes? The Spirit immediately drives him out to be tested. This is no temptation scene. We do this injustice by calling it a temptation. It's not like the scene in Matthew and Luke. There's no game of wits. There's no quoting of Scripture. It's just these two little sentences. There's no plot here. Notice Jesus doesn't do anything in this scene. He's driven out by the Spirit. He's tested by Satan. He's with wild beasts. He's waited on by angels. He's just there. He doesn't do a thing. So the passage is not a temptation scene. It's more just setting the scene for the whole book. It sets up a dualistic, cosmic, apocalyptic battle. Now, that's not stuff we feel real comfortable with in the 21st century. We don't do a lot of apocalyptic talk these days. Well, maybe this side of the room doesn't. But so apocalyptic talk's not right there on the tip of our tongues anymore. But it is thoroughly in the New Testament. Every page is eschatological in nature. Every paragraph is. So what Mark is doing with this little scene is saying, I'm going to display the battle between Team Jesus and Team Satan. And this is the opening of it. We don't have Jesus winning the day here the way he does in the others. He's just there. But the very next moment, Jesus, who was passive, now becomes active. He begins preaching, the time is fulfilled, the reign of God has come near, repent and believe in the good news. So now it's clear Jesus is taking on Satan. He's coming after him. It's important to recognize what's happening in this proclamation of the reign of God. Any ancient person would have heard it as over against something. So often if people hear today reign of God or reign of heaven, they think it's over against earthly life or something like that. Context makes the difference. So if I were to say Bonnie is a woman, out of context you might assume that I'm asserting her sex or gender. But if I had just said Margaret is a girl, I'm asserting something about age and maturity as opposed to gender. The context in which kingdom of God is proclaimed relates to the same context in which Son of God is used. And that is over against the reign of Caesar. So in the ancient world, Caesar was called the Son of God. So when Jesus is called Son of God, it's a threat to Caesar. Or it's a subordinate, that's not right, subversive claim. Same way, to proclaim the reign of God is to take on the reign of Caesar. So Mark, from the very beginning, has this apocalyptic political edge going on that we often miss because we've domesticated the gospel over the years of reading it. But any ancient person would have heard it this way exactly. So our prologue is set. The teams, the armies are set against each other. We're ready to begin with the rising action. Now that Jesus has begun to take on Satan, the first thing he does is gather people to his side. The call of the disciples. Note how Mark doesn't say anything about why the disciples joined Jesus. There's no here that they heard about his miracles. There's no expectation that they know anything he's taught. Jesus says, jump. And they say, how far? They are the perfect model for faithful obedience. So they become on Jesus' side. And they are what we want to be. We want to respond with that same kind of faith. And so they are our representatives in the story, imagining us as those first original hearers. So, isn't it good to be on Jesus' side? That's the way we're those kind of people of faith. We want to join in that way. Their faith is inspiring. That's who I am. Well, now that he has his army together, Jesus starts taking on Satan's army. In different scenes across this rising action, he exorcises unclean spirits. Here in this summary of his healing, we have the first appearance of what scholars call the Messianic Secret. You know what this is about. Jesus tells demons and people he's healed and he and his disciples to tell no one. It's the worst marketing campaign ever. And some people I've heard try and psychologize this. Oh, the reason he tells them not to tell anyone is so that they will. It's funny how we often feel like we have to explain what Scripture should have done. It would make sense if the demons were lying about who Jesus is, if they were offering fake news. But they're not. The reason it says Jesus silenced them is because they know who he is. So this is the first hint that we're dealing with a parable here. It doesn't make sense to say, no, don't tell anybody the truth about me. Why? So we're starting to get a little hint that this is a mustard tree we're building here. At the beginning of chapter 2, some people bring Jesus a paralytic for him to heal. Jesus first offers him forgiveness. And what do we see? We see the scribes against him. After he calls Levi to follow him, who jumps just like the first four did, the scribes of the Pharisees challenge Jesus for eating with sinners. So the list of Team Satan continues to grow. I'm just giving examples. We don't have time to, of course, work verse by verse. John's disciples and the Pharisees are fasting even though they have the bridegroom with them. We will see them testing Jesus, and they uses the same word that was used of Satan earlier. We'll see them testing Jesus numerous times throughout the gospel. Within the span of a chapter and a half, Mark has taken us from the conflict scene in the wilderness that established the conflict between Jesus and Satan to compiling the list of those with Jesus and those on Satan's side to the point that the Pharisees are now partnering with the Herodians to kill Jesus. Notice we're only at the beginning of chapter 3, and the ending is already foreshadowed. They are looking for how to destroy him. And who are these Herodians? We don't know historically. This is the only time this kind of language shows up in the tradition or in other literature. But at the very least, we know who Herod was and Herod's family who ruled. They were Rome-empowered people to control the area. And so Herod is clearly on the side of Team Satan, Team Caesar. The Herodians are a political, religious kind of character here. They're joined with the religious leaders. So we already, right here at the beginning, have political power and religious power together, conspiring to kill Jesus. If that weren't bad enough, in Mark, later in the chapter 3, Mark presents the scene in which the scribes from Jerusalem accuse Jesus of casting out by demons by having Beelzebul, right? That's what they say. Jesus shows how ludicrous his argument is. I mean, it's ridiculous to imagine Team Jesus playing for Team Satan. If we're casting out demons who are on their side, if we're taking care of business, then we can't be seen as doing that. In language echoing the trial story, the Spirit enters Jesus, Spirit takes Jesus in the wilderness. We also get, this is blasphemy. Sin against the Holy Spirit is a blasphemy that's unforgivable. Now, Mark rarely shows Jesus' interior feelings or thoughts. So it's important to recognize that we don't know whether the scribes here are intentionally lying or they really believe what they're saying. It doesn't really matter because their smear campaign shows that they just simply don't realize that they are working on behalf of Satan and Caesar's kingdom fully to recognize that they're against God. They may have somehow put it together. This is the first place where Mark uses his famous sandwich technique, where you have a piece of bread, a piece of meat in the middle, and then another piece of bread. The two pieces of bread is a story split in half. So here we have the opening piece of bread is Jesus' family hears that he is beside himself. It's the Greek root of ecstasy. He's outside himself. He's mentally disturbed. So they come to take him. In between, we get the scribes accusing him of casting out by Beelzebul. And then at the end, we get the mothers and brothers arrive. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. So we've had the passage of time. And the reason Mark uses this sandwich is so that the two pieces, the bread and the inside, interpret each other. So what we see is that Jesus' family even is on the side of Team Satan. Like the scribes, they are misunderstanding who he is. And misunderstanding is a lack of faith. But thank heavens for the disciples pointed out here. Our representatives in the story. While increasing the number of people on the side against Jesus, Mark reasserts the role of the disciples as those who are faithfully obedient. Family, after all. Isn't that wonderful? And then, darn it, comes chapter 4. In the very next chapter, the Parables Discourse, after all, the parabolic quality of Mark's narrative comes into full force with, of all things, parables. It starts with the familiar parable of the sower, and then those around him, that is, those who were just sitting there and he called his family, those who were said to do the will of God, they come to Jesus and ask, why does he speak in parables? Well, Jesus hadn't yet read C.H. Dodd's definition of parables. And so he gives his own purpose for speaking in parables. Insiders possess the mystery of God's reign, but for outsiders, everything is spoken in parables. In order that they may indeed look but not perceive, may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. Parables, says Mark's Jesus, is to keep outsiders outside. Preach that on Sunday morning, people. Parables draw the line between those inside and those out. Those inside, we have the mystery of God's reign. Those outside do not. Thank heavens for us, right? But then we have a problem. The very next line. And Jesus said to them, do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? Wait. The disciples have dropped a little, and we've dropped with them. What does this mean? Are we insiders or out? Well, in case we might think that was just a little passing dig to get everybody in line, at the end of the Parables Discourse, it says, with many such parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. If you're an insider, you shouldn't need the explanation. They weren't getting it. Insiders or outsiders? Mark's not quite ready to end this indicting chapter yet. Immediately following the Parables Discourse, he tells the story of Jesus calming the storm. We want to direct our attention to the end of the story. Jesus indicts the disciples even more explicitly than he had in the parables scene. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? Notice what Mark has just done. He's equated lack of faith and fear. How does the gospel end? They told no one nothing, for they were afraid. So this is a recurring theme. We won't be able to show it over and over again, but it shows up in numerous times. If that weren't bad enough, then Mark presents the disciples as asking the most indicting question themselves. Who is this? These are the same disciples who left Father behind at the boat just because Jesus said, follow me, and they didn't know who they were following? Who is this? So, if they are our representatives, Mark seems to be indicting us as well. Do we really know who Jesus is? It just keeps adding on. We jump to chapter 6. Jesus returns to his hometown. They too are unable to see Jesus for who he is. The us group gets harder and harder pushed over. Mark presents Jesus as teaching and preaching throughout Galilee, but the conflict continues. Here, his home church, same place. So they use exactly the same language. And Jesus, have you no faith? So what are we going to do? So you see what's happening. The disciples' status is now iffy. Your status as an insider of the reign of God is now iffy. But Jesus then sends out the 12 to cast out demons, to preach the reign of God, to go with his authority. Maybe there's hope here after all. It's a matter of putting feet to your faith, and that'll take care of it. And in the meantime, we learn of Herod beheading John the Baptist. Herod beheading John the Baptist. So we know the Herodians are the horrible thing, because now we see the violent power behind them that could be applied to Jesus. The disciples return from their mission. Jesus takes them to a wilderness or deserted place to be alone. But the crowds follow them, and he ends up feeding the 5,000. So he does this miraculous thing. Then Jesus sends the disciples ahead by boat, and he decides to take a stroll out on the water. When the disciples see him, they are afraid. Fear, lack of faith. They've just seen what Jesus could do, and yet they're still afraid here. The narrator concludes this scene by telling us that the disciples didn't understand about the loaves, so we're connected back to the previous scene. And more, there's something new here. Their hearts were hardened. No ancient person would have missed the connection with Pharaoh. They are on that enemy side. So we keep slipping over, hoping Jesus is going to redeem the disciples, hoping Mark's going to show us that we're really insiders, and he just keeps twisting the story and pushing us to the other side. Now we start heading to Jerusalem, but before Jesus heads south, he heads north up to Caesarea Philippi. Jesus leaves Galilee at some 30 miles north, and you need to know a little bit about Caesarea Philippi to get the full impact of this story. We haven't dealt a lot with setting, but a good literary reading should. Herod the Great's son, Philip, had been tetrarch of this region. He had built this city, and he named it Caesarea in honor of Caesar, in honor of Augustus. So in Jesus' day, this city was a symbol of the political partnership of the Herodians and the Romans. So this is the city Jesus intentionally goes to. But that's not all. Remember we said Mark was written sometime around the year 70. After the Roman army destroyed the temple, they'd done their job, they came back to Caesarea Philippi, and they had games to celebrate their victory. So in Mark's day, this is a place known as the place where the Romans celebrate their dominion over Palestine. It is this place where Jesus decides it's time to have a talk about my identity. Over against Caesar and the Roman imperial forces. Well, it's clear the crowds are confused about who Jesus is. We've seen that for Mark. Misunderstanding equals being an outsider to God's reign. We're not surprised that the crowds are confused. But then Jesus asked the disciples, who do they say Jesus is? And Peter's answer for the group is, you are the Messiah, the Christ. Thank heavens. Maybe this gets us back. Maybe it was just that it took Peter a while to come to full understanding. But then that darn Messianic Secret motif shows up again. It's as if Peter proclaims, you're the Christ, and Jesus says, shut up. Now maybe you think I'm reading too much into that line, but the scene continues. The Markan Jesus describes the first passion and resurrection. This is the first passion and resurrection prediction of Jesus. Notice that the Christological language shifts. Peter says, you're the Christ. Jesus says, the Son of the human. So he shifts titles. But Peter steps up again to represent the disciples and us, the readers. And Peter rebukes Jesus, saying, no, that's not the kind of Christ I meant. And then Peter is rebuked by Jesus. And this language is stinging. Given that we see this in the context of the testing scene set up before, Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Standing in the city named Emperor, Jesus equates his disciples, our representatives, with God's adversary, who has established the very reign of Caesar in the first place. Now, it would be nice if we could just pin this all on Peter. He's the idiot alone. We're really represented by the other disciples in the story. But Mark won't let us. He makes clear that Jesus is looking at the disciples as he rebukes Peter. And then he turns to the crowds. So Mark has parabolically twisted the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, into an indictment of us. Why would you do that after the fall of the temple? Why, if you're trying to keep people in the faith in the face of theodicy, do you first say, let's push them over the edge? Let's make sure they're all at rock bottom. But that's what it feels like what's happening right here. We're being accused of not knowing who Jesus is, even though we follow him. And in our ignorance, even while following Jesus, we have aligned ourselves with satanic, oppressive, evil forces of the cosmos. Right after that scene in Caesarea Philippi, Mark narrates the story of the Transfiguration. Peter still shows his misunderstanding by wanting to stay up on the mountain. Probably a lot of you preached this just 2 weeks ago. Coming down the mountain, Jesus said he had to go to Jerusalem and be raised. The heavenly voice proclaims to the disciples. Notice now, the voice that was silent, that was only private at the baptism now speaks to the disciples. So maybe that's what it takes, right? They didn't get to hear what we got to hear before. So now they get to hear it. The voice says, listen to him. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Then they head down the mountain. And Mark returns to the motif of the Messianic Secret. Jesus tells them to tell no one what they had seen. But there's something new here. Over and over again, Jesus has told people, tell no one. But now he says, until I have risen from the dead. The disciples obeyed, but Mark describes them as not understanding what Jesus meant by rising from the dead. Even though he had just told them, I'm going to suffer and die and rise again. And the voice said, listen to him. What? So, we hoped for redemption at this moment. That the epiphany on the mountain would bring us back in. But we are lost and left there. So then, Jesus begins to teach them the Son of Man. Oh, that's back, sorry. I got an extra slide in there, shouldn't be. All right, so we saw the passion prediction there. We get two more passion predictions later on the way at 9:30 and 10:32. Mark's apocalyptic military roster is pretty much set from this point on. What Mark does to the rest of the journey is simply reassert the indictment over and over again in different ways. So these are two great examples. In the second passion prediction, Jesus says, we're on the way to Jerusalem. It's there that I'm going to suffer and die. And the disciples start arguing about who's the greatest. You know what that argument is? Ooh, there's going to be an opening at the top. I think I should be the one who steps in. No, me. So just as Peter responded inappropriately, so do all the disciples at this point. Third passion prediction comes along, and James and John, like everyone's kid, says, can you do us a favor without saying what the favor is? Dad, can I have something? Sure. No, yes, what? So Jesus asks, what? We want to be on your right and your left when you come into glory. Now notice what just happened. I'm going to die. Hey, Jesus, can we be on your right and your left when you come into glory? Now in the context, that might refer to the resurrection. So James and John say, well, great, we know you're coming back and be in power. We want to be on your right and left. All the disciples then start getting into battle again over this. But Jesus says, the one to sit on my right and my left in my glory is not for me to choose. It's already been chosen. So these are two disciples who also witnessed the Transfiguration, and they are still missing the point. All right, for the sake of time, which is running short, we're going to jump ahead to the Jerusalem narrative where Jesus finally encounters the temple. The triumphal entry that we celebrate on Palm Sunday is hardly triumphant in Mark's gospel. All this trekking in, all this parade, and Jesus peeks his head in the back door and says, and leaves. And that's the end of it. Seems an odd scene. But the next day we get the beginning of another sandwich in Mark. Jesus is returning from the suburbs to Jerusalem. He was tired. Okay, so he comes back, passes a fig tree, and he curses it. This is one of the oddest scenes. If you didn't know this was a parable before, you've got to see it's a parable here, because Jesus curses the fig tree because it has no figs when it's not supposed to have figs. That's your Messiah. That's your comforting, liberating Messiah. No figs? Dead to me. If you read this at the literal level, Jesus does not look good. But Mark has trained us to notice that there are twists in parables. So we're looking for what's going on. So next comes Jesus in the temple. We often call this the cleansing of the temple, but there's actually no cleansing happening. Not in this version anyway. That's often reading it through the lens in John. But in Mark, what Mark does basically is stop the temple from functioning. So he stops the money changers from changing out profane money to be able to spend temple shekels. He stops the sellers from selling doves that poor people could use for sacrifices. He stops the Levites from carrying utensils around, it seems like. So he stops the temple from functioning, basically. Notice what happens here. We get the same language we got back in chapter 3 when the chief priests and the scribes heard it. They kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him. So now fear is not just lack of faith, it's ratcheted up to going against Jesus and wanting to kill him. We get the second piece of bread following. Jesus goes out of town, comes back in, and recognizes that the fig tree has now withered. So think about how the logic of the sandwich worked. Jesus curses the fig tree. The fig tree, in the middle should be the temple. The fig tree withers. And so we get the idea that the temple also will wither. So what we have going is the parable is now related to the specific circumstances the original readers are hearing. We shouldn't have been so concerned about the temple falling in the year 70, Mark's community, because Jesus had already declared it defunct back in his time. Now, you got to be careful to avoid, if you preach this or read this out loud in any way that sounds anti-Semitic, given the way the tradition has used these kinds of stories. You got to remember the early church, I've said, were very much dedicated to the idea that God's presence was somehow still revealed through the temple, held at the temple. So this is not an anti-Jewish claim. This is an East of Eden claim. When you are no longer in the shadow of the temple, how do you explain it being gone? And you're trying to make sense of it. We're going to come back to it in a minute. But we need to be very careful that we don't accidentally use language when preaching these things that allow people to hear it in an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish way. Let's jump ahead a little bit further. After the Last Supper, Judas's betrayal is already underway. Jesus tells the disciples they will all desert him. But he softens the indictment by saying that they will see him again in Galilee after his resurrection. Peter declares, no, I would never desert you. I'm willing to die with you. And everybody says, yeah, me too, right? But Jesus' indictment holds, and he strengthens it by referring to the denial that we all know is coming. And sure enough, at his arrest, all of them deserted him and fled. All of them. Judas leads a crowd of chief priests, scribes, and elders with clubs and swords, and they're gone. But then Mark throws in the oddest scene of all scenes. A certain young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. Or as we would say in Silicaga, naked. Who is this young man? Why are we told he's wrapped in a linen cloth? And why are we told he runs off naked? Now, in the past, scholars tried to argue this is the author of the book. I don't think that flies. I think looking for a historical explanation doesn't work. We need to look for a parabolic explanation for all these strange elements. Remember, parables are supposed to make you ask the theological question, what the hell? So it's supposed to raise a question, and this does. So what is going on here? At his trial before the Sanhedrin, we see the fate of the temple and Jesus' identity wrapped up together. False testimony has him claiming that he is going to destroy the temple instead of him simply predicting its destruction. But there's that odd addition about Jesus rebuilding a temple not made of hands in 3 days. Again, we, the readers, recognize the irony here, and we hear in that a reference to the resurrection. Even though the witnesses think they're lying, they're speaking some level of truth. A few lines later in the scene, the high priest asks Jesus if he is God's son, and for the first time in the narrative, we get Jesus to explicitly say, yes, Son of God, that's me. But then immediately he goes on and he adds son of the human language, uniting it with it. It's important to recognize that they all condemn him, every member of the Sanhedrin. So it's a unanimous decision, and they are added to the list here at the end. Peter's denial 3 times. He has followed him, at least from a distance here. But then the 3rd time, he doesn't simply say, no, I'm not from Galilee. I don't know what you're talking about. He says, I do not know this man. This is the most ironic moment of the whole parable. Peter thinks he's lying, but he's telling the truth. And in so doing, he indicts us that at this moment we do not know who Jesus is. We keep holding on, we don't know. Mark just makes it very clear. So this last moment right before the crucifixion. When we arrive at Jesus' crucifixion, Mark's description is important to note. A sign reads, King of the Jews. And one person is crucified on his right and another on his left. The language echoes James and John's question. And suddenly we realize this is the moment of glory. Whatever that means. That the cross is the moment. Not resurrection, not some high mountain point. The cross is the throne in some ways. So cross, Jesus' powerlessness in confronting the power of Team Satan is actually his glory. Now that's parable. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. We get to Jesus' death. Jesus cries out for God. My God, why have you forsaken me? But the God who spoke to him at his baptism is silent. The God who spoke on the mountain of Transfiguration is silent. But then as Jesus dies, the curtain of the temple is ripped in 2. In Greek, the word ripped here is the same word used for the heavens being ripped at his baptism. The only 2 places these words appear in the gospel. God acts at this moment. I've often heard preachers talk about the rending of the temple as a sign that Gentiles are now allowed in. But given Mark's parabolic approach to the destruction of the temple, I think it's a sign of God exiting the temple. God's presence is not limited to there. God's presence is found somewhere else now. Jesus' death and God's action with the temple curtain leads the first human in the story then to declare Jesus to be God's son. No other human has said this. Everyone else has called him teacher or Christ, and Jesus has silenced them. And who is it that gets it? The centurion. The person who just crucified Jesus. Just showed the power of Rome over against the powerlessness of this Son of God. He's the one who recognizes it. He is the manifestation of Satan's team in everyday life in Judea, in this ancient world. You get it? He's the insider and we're not. That stings. Mark is twisting the parable. Now, because it's a parable, we're okay to go, I know there's no such thing as a mustard tree, but the mustard tree is bugging the hell out of me right now. This is supposed to lead us to existential questioning, theological questioning. Not just who do I say Jesus is, but who am I in relation to Jesus? If he is an insider and I'm an outsider, what does that say? It's interesting to note, but as we head back, Jesus is buried improperly by one who voted for his death. We often see Joseph of Arimathea as this great guy, but remember, he voted with the whole Sanhedrin that Jesus should die. We finally get back to this scene, this failed ending. Jesus has silenced demons, healed people and disciples. He silenced them all. And finally, at the end, someone is told to go and tell people. These women who find the tomb empty. We too often assume that the one speaking to the women is an angel because we harmonize with Matthew. But Mark is quite willing to mention angels when he wants to, back at the testing story he did, remember? At Jesus' arrest, a young man, wrapped in linen, ran away naked. Here we find Jesus' body has been wrapped in a linen cloth, and now there's a young man dressed in a white robe, like those on the Mount of Transfiguration, like those baptized in the early church. And this young man who ran away now declares Jesus' resurrection. One who deserted has returned. He offers us all the chance to return. Now that we've witnessed the powerlessness of the cross as the place where the reign of Caesar is finally, fully, really confronted and transformed, so now we can understand what it means to declare Jesus to be God's Son, who brings about God's reign, and we can better understand what it means to follow him. The promise is that the disciples can meet the crucified and risen Son back in Galilee. This is a parabolic invitation to revisit everything we think we know of Jesus, everything that we read about what he did in the earlier part of the narrative in Galilee, in light of the crucifixion. To now see Jesus as dealing with the suffering of the people as one who suffers with them. I think when people assert a glory theology rooted in the resurrection more strongly than the cross, Mark gets really nervous. When everyone shows up for worship on Easter and no one comes out for Good Friday, Mark thinks to himself, they are still missing the point. Now, I'm not talking about substitutionary atonement here. That's not what Mark deals in. We find the Son of God when we are in the midst of suffering. We find the Son of God suffering with the suffering, and in so doing, challenging those who cause the suffering and stripping them of their power. The young man always, even today, sits at the empty tomb where we hope to find the glory of God and says, "But you should get back to Galilee where people are hurting." The temple curtain's been torn. You want the presence of God? Go where God's presence is most needed. And when the church is willing to make that trek to the sick, to the demon-possessed, to the one seeking good news, there we become insiders to the reign of God. Thus ends the reading. It's about time for lunch. We have a 2-hour workshop. At that point, we'll have Q&A, as well as move into discussing preaching from parables more generally as we move towards the homiletical thing. Thank you for your attentiveness, and I look forward to being in more direct conversation with you. Thank you.